right now, returning from the break, we are joined by Joanna Shear, a member of both the Global Jewish Genealogy Society and the California Genealogical Society. Joanna began her journey with a Silver Cup and a mystery, and today her research reaches generation torn apart by the Holocaust. A graduate of Boston University's certificate program in genealogical research, Joanna brings a vast experience in Jewish and African American genealogy. Her session will unpack strategy in navigating Jewish ancestry, DNA analysis, and overcome research barrier. Let's all welcome Joanna Shear to this podium. Thank you.
Thank you. It has been, I can't remember the last time I was giving a presentation live. I think it was in my last life as an engineer. So please be kind. Oh, okay, is that better? All right, I didn't want to get too close. Okay, so we're going to talk about Jewish genealogy, and there's a lot of topics here, and there's a lot of material. So I may go fast. I'm happy to answer any questions. A lot of the links for the materials that I'm going to talk about are in the handout, so do get that. So we're going to talk about the challenges that we have in tracing Jewish family histories, some of the specialized resources that provide the data that we need to answer questions. I want to focus on what are the fundamental strategies that we can use that are really common to all genealogy that provide structure for solving our family mysteries. And then I'm going to give an example from my family to show how these come together. So here's just a chart to give you a sense of the rate of Jewish immigration to the U.S. Jews have been in North America since the 1500s, very small numbers. Immigration was minimal until there was a jump in the mid-1800s together with people from Germanic countries. And those people tended to be farmers, merchants, craftspeople, generally of moderate means. But starting in the 1880s, immigration accelerated from Eastern Europe, and these immigrants were living under quite different conditions from the past ones. And again, I'm speaking on average. There were people of every type coming. And while there were people involved in trades and crafts, many fewer were farmers or landowners, and many were very poor. And that time period between 1880 and 1824, with the Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, sharply cut immigration for every group, many groups, let's just say. And those immigration restrictions stayed in place in the pre-war period, preventing many people from escaping Europe and the Holocaust. So what is Jewish genealogy? Well, Jewish genealogy really is just genealogy, right? But it's the devil's in the details. We understand history to place our families in the context. We understand the practices and traditions to inform our searches for information. We learn the data sets that contain our family's records, and that goes from those broad data sets that everyone would be in to very specific ones that only our family or communities would be in. And then applying sound fundamental strategies to the challenges in tracing our specific family histories. And none of these are unique to Jewish family history, but here are some challenges that we often encounter. Names change. When you have immigrants coming from non-English speaking countries to the United States, you have name changes. And there's some special complexities. I'm going to go into detail on all of these in the next slides. We have difficulty identifying the country and towns of origin. And we have issues with record availability. Now, I heard Richard mention something about DNA. I do research in DNA, but what's missing from that list is DNA, because I am not going to talk about DNA in this presentation. Using genetic genealogy to expand our family knowledge of our families is a real problem with the Jewish community. We have what's called endogamy. Again, not unique to Jews. There are many other groups that have endogamy, but endogamy means that because of a small founder population and because of intermarriage over many, many generations, it gets difficult to tease out how a person is related to you, even whether they're on your mother or father's side, or if it's your father's side, whether his mother or his father. It's very complicated. There are absolutely tools for doing this, and you can learn from this, but genetic genealogy by itself is a big topic, and then when we get into that, that's definitely not introductory. So this is the last I'm going to talk about DNA in this presentation. Okay, so let's move into names. First, I'm going to talk about surnames. So traditional naming practices in the Jewish community, the father's name was used as an identifier. So for example, my father would be David ben Moshe, right? My grandfather was Murray, but his Hebrew name was Moshe. So David ben Moshe, right? And those names would then change, not just every generation, but between generations. So governments have an interest in wanting surnames to be permanent. They want to track families, they want to collect taxes, and naturally that's also one reason why people resisted having permanent surnames or even changed them over time. But there were legal requirements for starting the adoption of permanent surnames, and in Europe that differed by country. I believe that in many Germanic countries that was done in the 1700s. In the Austrian Empire, it was the early 1800s, and it wasn't until the late 1860s in Russia. And frankly, it seems like my family, they just weren't attached to those surnames, And of course, within the community, even today, right, that patronymic naming is still used. Another issue is that there's just variations in names. So I have a family surname Feivelson. But when I go to look for that family in Europe, they could be under Feivelson, they could be under Feivel. Feivel is a diminutive of the name Feivish. So then they also show up as Feivish and Feiverson. So you can find family members under all those names, and they didn't, again, it's this sort of lack of real attachment to the surname. Another issue is just spelling versus pronunciation. Names may not have changed at all, but the way it's spelled may be very different from how someone might pronounce it in English, and then over time, they might change the spelling in English to match the pronunciation, and then you have trouble tracking. Something that was specific to the Jewish community in Galicia, which is a region of the Austrian Empire, is people would often use their mother's surname. And the reason for that was that the Austrians had very restrictive rules and special taxes. So to get a marriage license, to get a civil marriage in Galicia was expensive, and many people, they just didn't do it. So they got married legally in front of a rabbi. They never bothered to get the civil license. So they weren't officially, in the eyes of the government, married. Therefore, the children were not officially products of the marriage. Right. So their official surname was their mother's surname. Now, that actually changed, but people still, that engendered like suspicion of the government. So it continued to not get civil. But they did get married. People did get married, but sometimes people would continue to use their mother's surname. Sometimes they would come to the U.S. and change their surname to their father's. I've seen families where people had both surnames, siblings, because some people changed it and some people didn't. So names were sometimes changed in Europe, many times changed in the U.S., maybe the first generation, maybe the second generation. One place they were never changed was Ellis Island. This is a very common story in many people's families, and there is no way and no structure and no possibility of names being permanently changed on Ellis Island just because of the way things were set up at the point of immigration. So when we hear from our families that the name was changed at Ellis Island, there's usually more to the story. So that you just have to dig on that. So here's some examples. This is one, the Kohanim, for example, people from that line, they may have the name Cohen, they may Cohn, Kahane, Kagan, Katz, Kaganovich, those could all be from the same family, right? And the next one is my family. So Sackman, Shackman, Shackner, and Sachs, all the same name. But in fact, the first two, Sackman and Shackman, those are an example of spelling versus pronunciation. It took us forever to find the Shackmans on the passenger manifest because it was spelled Sackman, because Sackman was pronounced Shackman in Romania. So I have a family called Turovsky, the second generation, maybe because of anti-Soviet, I'm not sure. They changed their name, so we had four siblings, four names, Turovsky, Turov, Trof, and Troy. And then an in-law line, his name was Max Garfunkel, and he changed his name to Garfunkel on the passenger manifest. So when he left Europe, it was Garfunkel, even though his original surname was Gerfel. I think we should probably leave them till the end, if that's okay. Okay. Okay, given names. Now, typically people had both a Jewish name, Hebrew or Yiddish, and a secular name. And if they lived in a larger city or town in Europe, they might have had one there, but certainly when they came to the United States. And so the name Liba could be Lily or Lena, Heike could be Ida or Clara, Moishe could be Marcus or Morris. It could really be anything. It doesn't have to start with the same letter. People pick names that were popular, and I think that's why we see a whole lot of Morris Cohens, because Morris was a popular name at the time. It wasn't a particularly Jewish name, but when they came, they picked the name, so we see a lot of that. Double names. So double names are really interesting, make things complicated. It wasn't a first and middle name. They were two names together. And there's a whole, I do have links in the resource page about this. They can be related, so it could be a biblical association. I think the names Naphtali, Hirsch, those have some biblical story, and so those are often seen together. It could be meaning or just language variants or others. Arya Lieb, one of those words is Hebrew and the other is Yiddish, and they both mean lion. So they would be put together that way. And then Esther Malka. Malka means queen. Esther's a famous queen. So, and then another issue that you might see is just a nickname. So Moshe Yaakov, the Yiddish name for Yaakov is Yankel. And you could see the same person listed as Moshe, listed as Morris, listed as Yankel, listed as Jake, right? So I'm just saying it's complicated. You have to keep this in mind when you're looking at the records, that just because it's not the name you knew, sometimes you have to push to figure out what's going on. Okay, identifying the originating location. So in order to figure out where our ancestors came from and then uncover more details about their lives and push it back to the previous generations, we need to follow the clues. So often records will say Russia or Austria, or Russia, Poland. And we need to really look at all the available records in the US, because sometimes you will find hints in those that give you more detail. As well as you also have to learn about the history of Europe to some degree to decode those locations. So Russia could mean, of course, Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, Lithuania. I think we kind of know that, right? But Austria could be Ukraine or Poland. And then the family stories we get, sometimes they're great hints, and sometimes they are, off in the wrong direction. I have one family, they say they're from Latvia or Lithuania or Poland, okay? And then people use different languages. So on the passenger manifest, you'll see, in the later manifest, you'll see where people say they came from. And they may have used the Yiddish name for the town, which is different from the name most people would know. So I'm going to show you some resources for figuring those out. And then this is something that happens all the time today. I mean, people from smaller towns will sometimes give the name of the big town as where they were from, or if it's a region, and then sometimes you have regions like Minsk that also have a town named Minsk, so it can get confusing. So this is just, I had a whole bunch of maps and I just ended up putting one. So this is the map from 1905. And if you're familiar with the current countries of Europe, you'll see many differences. And this was a pivotal time, so the pre-World War I period. If you were to have looked 50 years or 75 years earlier, it would have looked different. In the period between World War I and World War II, it was different, and then, of course, afterwards. There is a really big country missing from this map, and that's Poland. There was no Poland as a country during this period. And a friend of mine used to say every country in Europe was part of the largest country in Europe at some time, right? So Austria-Hungary, you see, is way past the borders of Austria and Hungary today. Okay, record availability. First thing I just want to say is remember, Most records are not online still. So whether those are deeds from a county clerk in Iowa or vital records from Lithuania, most records are not online, but online sources are so complete now they can help guide you to how to find those records, whether or not they're online. So since Jews were prohibited from owning land, in the Russia's Pale of Settlement, as well as numerous other countries, there was less of a history of land ownership. And during the surge of arrivals that started around 1880, many of the people were really very poor and settled in urban centers. So they were just less likely anyway to be able to afford buying land. So land records are, one of the basic genealogical sources, and they should absolutely be searched. But it just happens that there's fewer land records often for us. Going back to the previous bullet, so this is kind of maybe obvious, but because a lot of immigration was more recent, there's going to be fewer U.S. records. It's just sort of obvious. On the bright side, the immigration information is way more rich for those later immigrants than it was for people in the first half of the 19th century, for example. But you're just not going to be able to get as far back before you run out of records. Religious records. So religious records for many communities are really, very, give them a lot of information. Unfortunately, there's no central registration for Jewish records. And of course, there was a lot of destruction of records in Europe. If your family was from Western Europe, there are a lot of records in Germany, a lot of religious records in Germany, France especially, and England. Even in the US, it's kind of hit and miss. There are a lot of shoals that are no longer in existence, but there are places that have archives. So they should be looked for again, but it's just not as great a source. Barriers to accessing records in Europe. So, we have the Cyrillic alphabet for those of us who can't read it. That's kind of a barrier. Political issues, lack of indexing and digitization. I mean, digitization is really increasing a lot, but it's still, not up to where it is some other places. So we need to be creative in looking for additional sources, which brings me to specialized sources. So the most important specialized source that you should know if you haven't done much work in Jewish genealogy is JewishGen. So it's a site that you need to register to use, but it is free. There is a premium option, which gives you some more control over your searches. But it contains databases with many different record sources. Some of them are indexes that will point you to the original record that you will need to get in person or get from a person. But some are completely available digitally. But it is way more. There is a family finder where you put in your family name and locations, and we had a family reunion based on the information that we found there. There's educational sources on traditions and history of towns. There's sort of formal genealogies, published genealogies, and class offerings, and on and on. So we're going to just look at two here, but you should get on the site if you're doing Jewish genealogy and explore the others. We're going to talk about the country and topical databases and the town finder. Okay, so the country and topical databases, this is under the research menu, and the main page has selections by country and region, as well as a general section. How does that look? It's a little hard to read, I can see. But it's got a general section where it has a lot of tools that are available. And so in this example, I'm going to pick one of the options under Lithuania, which is the JewishGen Lithuania collection. So you can see here that I've entered in the search box Chaya Nurak, which is the name that I have for one of my third great-grandmothers, but I don't really have very much on her other than her name. And I've narrowed the location down to the Shavel region. And one thing that I really want to point out is that below, you see all the detailed components of the database. So you'll be searching all of those when you enter this. And if you click on those links from here, it will tell you about the source, which is very, very useful. So if I click on that, I get some records that come back, and you can see it tells you which source they came from. And I'm going to select the revision list data from the Litvak-SIG. So revision lists are essentially censuses, and they were taken in Russia from the late 1700s through the early 1900s, primarily for the purposes, once again, of keeping track of taxpayers in the population. And when I look at the result, you can see it says Haya Rivka Nurak, oops, sorry. And she was 53 years old in 1866, which is in the right range for my ancestor. And so if you look on the side, there's a link. I'm not going to click it here, but this particular one does take you to a family search record that will show you information about her. But some of them don't have that. Some of them just have the information, and you can write to the archives for them. Okay, so the next feature is the town finder, and I got to say, this is the one that I use honestly the most, and I'll show you why. But you use it together with the records that you find in the US to overcome the challenge of determining the country of origin. So it's on the Discover menu, and then the search box provides a number of features there. You can narrow down the name of to looking under the name of the country in different time periods because they changed. I'm entering a town that was written in the American records as, you'd pronounce it Shadow, but I think it's actually Shadov, right? But this is how it's spelled, and sometimes you need to work through, a number of variations. And then what comes up are two different entries, and I got to tell you, sometimes it's not two, it's like 8. Because it's got all the variations here, all the languages that were used, the names for the town in all the languages. But in this case, these two towns that could be pronounced Shadov are in two very different locations. One of them is in Lithuania today, and one of them is in Ukraine today. And back in the before World War I, one of them was in the Russian Empire, and one of them was in the Austrian Empire. So if you see the town Shadov in some records, and your ancestor always said they were from Austria, then probably you want to focus on the second town. And this is how this can be used. When you click on it, you get even more information, and if you click on the little icon, it gives you a lot more about the town. So it's very, very helpful. Okay, there's a lot of sources here, and I'm going to go pretty fast so I can get through to the other sections. But the family search catalog, so if you do genealogy, you should get very familiar with family search. They have a guide to Jewish genealogy that is very helpful. And they have records that have been scanned. Most of them, I think, are not indexed in any way. And I haven't found them yet. They have a new feature where they have automation that does an every word search. And I haven't found them in that yet, but I'm hopeful. But you can look for a specific location. And then when you look at the location, you get a bunch of categories for the types of records. And if you see Jewish records, you want to expand that and look at it. And in this case, metrical books, which are the bottom two, those correspond to vital records, so births, marriages, deaths. The other category, some towns and some places have a lot of information there that have been scanned, but it's a lot of contextual information about the town that, if you don't speak the language, can be quite hard to get through. But if it's birth, marriage, death, then you get used to looking for those genealogically significant words and look for your ancestor's name. So, ancestry. Okay, ancestry has a large selection of records that some of them were sourced from Jewish Gen, and when you go into them, you can see that it says it came from Jewish Gen. Most Holocaust-related records are free to use without a subscription. So that means that even if you don't have a subscription or you're not here at the library using their resources, at home, just with with an ancestry account, which is free, you can use these records. And they're just a ton. I'm just going to flip through them. I went to the end. So there's pages on pages. So there are plenty of records there. But as you can see, it's a little bit of here, a little bit of there. You got to look at all the sources. Another few sources are ones that are specialized. So Japan record indexing, sorry, did I say Japan? Jewish record indexing for Poland, JRI Poland, is a project that has been indexing and scanning records now for decades. It says Poland, but remember, these records are kept in Poland, but they could have been from what's today Ukraine or Lithuania, right? So you look through, and these records are in Jewish Gen, but the interface for JRI can be more useful to narrow them down. Gesher Galicia, this focuses on that Galicia region. And again, they are on Jewish Gen. In some cases, it's just indexed, and to see the record itself, you have to come here to their site and get a membership there. And then the routes to roots. So this has been around for a very long time, and there are no records here. But what they do have is it tells you what records have been found and where they're located. And this can be useful to find the records, and it can be useful to tell you there are no records from that town. Because if there are no records from that town, then you want to start looking at other towns around or the city centers. So it's very useful. Okay, more here, and I'm just going to pick out a couple. So the Industrial Removal Office, which sounds pretty awful, doesn't it? And and HIAS, which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. These were organizations that sprang up to help handle the huge flood of immigrants who were coming in that period from the 1880s through the 1920s. The Industrial Removal Office, their goal was to settle people outside of New York City because New York was getting really crowded. So if you find your immigrant ancestor in Madison, Wisconsin, you might want to go look at the Industrial Removal Office, because my great-grandfather, who ended up in Dallas 3 days after he got off the boat, he had a ticket from them. Yeah, so HIAS actually is a great organization. It's still in existence today. It still helps immigrants today. The Landsmannschaften. Okay, so Landsmannschaften were mutual aid societies, and they were organized around the town of origin in Europe. And one of their main goals, one of their main functions was to make sure that people had a place to get buried. So they would take out burial sites in cemeteries. And sometimes they were within a larger cemetery, sometimes they were in a Jewish cemetery. But if you find your ancestor buried in a specific Landsmannschaft plot, then that may tell you where they're from. Now, not everyone buried there was from that town. Sometimes it was just that's what it was available, but it is a good clue. So there are lots of resources on the Holocaust. There's archives. Jewish newspapers are fantastic because oftentimes many people, their events didn't show up in the other regular newspapers, so you have to look at the Jewish newspapers sometimes to see about obituaries and things of that nature. So newspapers.com, Genealogy Bank, oldnews.com, those are general sites, and they do have Jewish newspapers, but the New York Public Library is really my go-to. They have lots, including Yiddish newspapers, and the National Library of Israel has global newspapers as well. Okay, networking. I am not on Facebook very much. Linda Okazaki, who gave the talk on Japanese genealogy, she mentioned it as well. But these groups are great. I mean, whether it's a general discussion about DNA or whether it is people from a specific region or town, the people on there are, I can guarantee you, more experienced than I am, whatever it is, and they can point you to resources and help you with translations. So it's a big benefit. And then societies. So the Global Jewish Genealogy Society, they're actually started in Santa Cruz. They're entirely online and are dedicated to education. The San Francisco Bay Area Jewish Genealogical Society has been around for quite a while, very helpful. The Jewish Genealogical Society of New York has specialized resources if your family did come through New York. California Genealogical Society isn't specific to Jewish genealogy, but they have a library and lots of very experienced people to help you there. And I want to say, don't forget about the historical societies. The Dallas Jewish Historical Society had, for example, a very big oral history project, and they just happened to have interviewed my great aunt who talked about her mother. So that was not online, but it did list the histories, and then they went and they made me a copy on a CD. So, okay, now I'm going to move on to talking about fundamentals. So the reason I want to talk about this is that while it is very easy to get started in genealogy, you just jump on an online platform, put in a tree, and you're going to get lots of hits. You're going to get lots of hints that tell you, oh, this could be your person. But just because the name's the same, it doesn't mean it's the same person. I don't know how much experience you have, but I have had whole lines that I had to cut off later because that was not the right person. And many clues, come from user-provided trees that may not have the documentation even to support the connections that they're showing, or records that don't really have enough information to confirm the identity. So by using structure and strategies, you can help verify the data and give you confidence that the Morris Cohen that you add to your tree is really yours and not someone else. Okay, so this is a research cycle. I'm going to talk about each of these in the next slides, but this is the basic process. Organize what you think you know, identify your question for that particular research, create a research plan, collect data, analyze your findings, and then go back to the beginning. So organize what you think you know. Well, collect information from family histories, interview your family members. Boy, how I wish I'd done that. Look for documents in your home or easily accessible for birth, death, marriage certificates, photos with names, things of that nature. Use software. I personally prefer offline software, but there's so much data that organizing it can be challenging if you don't have some application to help you with it. Make sure you note where that information came from when you're doing that. And think about what is undeniable fact and what is information that needs verification. How reliable was the person who gave the information? How likely were they to know that it was true? And start with yourself and work back so that you can identify the gaps. Okay, set a narrow research question. So we may have more qualitative questions like, why did our ancestors leave? What was their life like in their home village? And were they happy when they moved here? And these can be very difficult questions to answer. By understanding more the history and the context and the details of their lives, we can sometimes get insight. But in doing the research itself, it's very helpful to have a specific focus question. And that question should be on identity, relationship, maybe location, and uniquely identify the individuals involved so that both when you find information, you can say, is that the right person? Because I've uniquely identified them. And when you go ask someone for help or try to share the information, you can bring that information to another person as well. So here are a few examples. Who was the father of Jacob Shackman, husband of Elke Annie Nyman Shackman, who died on the 20th of February, 1937 in Dallas at about 65 years old? So I have the answer to that one. Which Morris Solomon was living in the household of Jacob and Devorah Solomon in the 1905 New York census? That one, haven't solved that one yet. Okay, create a research plan. And if you're just starting out, this can be challenging. You need to identify the types of sources that contain information to answer your question. But you can use area guides. These are out there. There's a lot of sources for them to know what information, what sources are available for the location you're looking at. And the Family Search Wiki, I use this constantly as far as location-based research. It has a lot there. And narrow down the specific sources for your question. And then you organize your search from the things that are most likely to answer the question to those that are least likely. And then be prepared to adjust it as you go along based on what you find as part of the process. Okay, collecting data. So document what you find as well as where and when you found it so you can find it again. Read records very carefully to be sure and get all the relevant data from them. And then it's best to record everything that looks important so that you don't need to retrace your steps later. And if you don't understand the meaning of a piece of data, which really happens all the time, you may need to research the type of record itself. When we were back on the Jewish Gen, and I said if you click on the database, it'll give you information about it. Sometimes they'll tell you a lot of information about the specific data that's in there, and that can be very helpful. Okay, analyze your findings. Again, make sure you understand the information you've collected. Then you want to correlate the data among the sources. So you want to compare and contrast what is conflicting information, what is supporting information. Assess the reliability of the informant of the data as well as the source itself. Is the person who gave the information likely to actually have known that? And I'm all about Excel tables, but creating charts and diagrams and tables can help visualize how the data connect. And assess whether you can prove the answer to your question based on the information you have. And then rinse and repeat. Did you answer your question? Yes, yay. Okay, update what you think you know, pick a new research question. No, which is most of the time, update what you think you know because you learned something. Add to your research plan, find more sources past the ones that you've already looked at, and continue to collect data. Okay, so I'm going to move on to my example about my puppy, what I think I know. So Rose Saul, who everyone called Bubby, was my mother's maternal grandmother, and she was born in Austria and died in 1981 in her 90s, and so I knew her, but of course, I never asked her any questions about her family. And her husband was Grandpa Joseph Saul. He died in 1964, which was the year I was born, and I was named after him. And they had 3 children, Zelda, my grandmother, Clarice, and Jack. They lived in New York City before they moved to Miami Beach in the 50s. Joe was a great cook and worked at a restaurant in Miami, and Rose was the youngest of 10 children. And that's what I knew. So my research question was, who were the parents of Rose Saul, who was born in Austria, married Joseph Saul in New York, was the mother of Zelda, Clarice, and Jack, and died in 1981 in Dallas. But as I'm approaching the research for that question, I'm probably going to look at some other questions as well. Where did the family live in New York? When did she marry Joseph Saul? When did she immigrate? And where was she from in Austria? And who were her siblings? So my starting research plan is one of the most basic. First, get all the vital records that you can: death, marriage, license, children's birth records, and that can help you know the name at birth, parents' names, and birthplace. Sometimes, right? Sometimes. And then the census records, which is such a rich resource in the United States. So we have the US Census. And then for this time period in New York City, we also have a New York Census on the 1905, 1915, and 1925. And those can give you, in addition to details about the person, also their year of immigration, depending on the census, their birthplace, and if family are living in the same household, then you can find family members as well. Okay, so here is Bubby's death certificate, and I know it's the right Rose Saul because there's my grandmother's signature. And I have a birth date, which I didn't know, May 15th, 1890, and it says Austria. She was born in Austria. And her father's name is listed as Isaac Stern, misspelled, but no mother's name, so unfortunately. And then I went to New York to look for their marriage certificate. And I did find one. This is a marriage certificate for Rose Stern and Joseph Saul. It has that address, which could be useful in looking for other records. And it also has the other information that we already had from the death certificate. Mother's name not known. Now, in New York, they went from having just this type of marriage certificate to a much more involved one that had several pages and including an affidavit, and I did find that additional certificate for them. And this asked for her place of birth, and she gave it as Galicia, which is more specific. And her father's name is given as Isidore, not Isaac. And finally, we have her mother's name, a mother's name, Sarah Lunger. So more information. And different, by the way, from that other marriage certificate, which presumably was filled out at the same time. So, okay, I'm not going to show you a recensus page. I went through and pulled out, this is a summary of the information from the censuses. And you can see that, starting in 1915, I should say they married in December 1910. So in 1915, Rose and Joe were living with not just Zelda and Clarice, but also Joe's mother-in-law, so Rose's mother, Sarah Stern, and also her sister, Lena, and her sister's husband, Harry. By 1920, Lena's still there, but her marital status is divorced. And as we go through the years, Sarah is there through 1930, although in 1925, it looks like her, but her name is given as Jenny. So here's the 1910 census, which was taken in April and was before Rose and Joe married. And it was really nice that I had that address from the marriage certificate because people moved a lot in New York City, a lot, sometimes every census. But here they are at 87 First Avenue, and here's the family. You can see Rose is there and a brother, another sibling, Morris, father Isidore, and mother Schindel. That's a third name. I had Sarah, I had Jenny, and now I have Schindel. Now, you can't always assume that the father's wife is the mother, right? But in this case, it says it's both of their first marriage. They've been married for 46 years, and she has 9 kids. So it really looks like she's the mom. And then we find them again in the 1905 census, thankfully at the same address. So in addition to Morris and Lena, we have a new sibling, David. And the father's name's really hard to read, but I think it's another variation of Isidore, and the mother is then Jenny or Janine. And here's some more information. It wasn't directly related to my question, but I wanted to pull the immigration dates from the censuses as well. And you can see that although there's some variability here, it kind of looks like they immigrated in the late 1890s. And then I did find the death certificate. So Isaac died in 1914. His name was Isaac Aaron Stern, father Jacob, mother Mary. We can be pretty sure her name wasn't really Mary. Maybe it was Miriam. Sarah died in 1933, which makes sense. She was in the 1930 census and not the 1940. It gives her father's name as Simon Lunger and her mother's as Rachel Lerner. Both were born in Austria, and they were married in Mount Zion Cemetery in the Tarnopoler II Landsmannschaft plot. So there were a whole bunch of other Sterns also buried in that same plot. So to analyze the findings, we have 2 names given for the father, Isaac and Isidore, from various sources. We have 3 first names given for the mother, Sarah, Jenny, and Schindel. Now, Isaac is a Hebrew name, Isidore is a Greek name, and looking at the names and some analysis of names, it is commonly used as an alternate secular name for Isaac. So probably his name was actually Isaac, but occasionally used Isidore. On the mother, it's more complicated. I mean, Sarah's a Hebrew name, Schindel's a Yiddish name. Sarah's a common English name, so maybe they wanted to use that instead of Schindel. I don't know about Jenny. So we're not sure at this point. Her name could have been Sarah or Schindel. Okay, did I answer my question? Probably for her father, but not the mother. And the family may have immigrated to the U.S. around 1897 to 1899. So maybe my next step is looking at naturalization and immigration documents. And then if I want to expand my search to Europe, I need to get some more information about Tarnopol. And is that burial plot a hint that they were actually from Tarnopol? So my new research plan is to look for naturalization records, immigration records, look up Tarnopol in the Jewish Gen Town Finder, and then if those look good, then go on to vital records. So I did find Rose's naturalization petition from 1935. It says that she immigrated in March 1898 on the SS Abdam, kind of a funny name, sailing from Rotterdam, and that she previously lived in Tarnopol. So there we go. Tarnopol was a good hint there. And the witnesses on her petition were her husband and Morris Stern, her brother, which we know he was her brother because we saw him on the censuses. And then we do find them on the arrival manifest. So they were on the SS Edom, so it was a misprint on the miswriting of it on the naturalization, the SS Edom. It's close enough. And they did arrive at the end of March 1898. Here's the family. So we see Rose, we see David, we see Moses, who is Morris, we see Isaac, and here we have a woman named Brana. Name number 4. And the family was from Tarnopol. So this sent me to the Jewish Gen looking for more information on Tarnopol, which you can see was part of Galicia in the Austrian Empire, and now, and this is important, is located in Ukraine, and the town is now Ternopil. But you need to know where it is now in order to guide your search within Jewish Gen, because you're not going to be looking at it, say, in Austrian data, records, you're going to be looking at it in Ukrainian records. So I go to the Jewish Gen Ukraine database, and I'm looking up Isaac Stern in Tarnopol. And I got to tell you, this is the family that I have the most information on because the Tarnopol records are very complete. Here is the marriage record of Isaac Stern, son of Jacob and Hindi Malii, sounds like Mary, to Shindel Brena, 2 names, daughter of Simche, Simon, and Ruchla, Rachel, Lunga. And finally, here is the birth record for Rose, named Riza, daughter, again, of Isaac Stern and Shindel Breni Lunga, born 19th of May, 1891. So I don't know if you remember her death record. It said the 15th of May, 1890. So we don't know at this point whether my grandmother got it wrong or whether she always celebrated her birthday on the 15th of May, because sometimes people didn't keep very track of that. But as I said, this is the family that I have the most records from their countries of origin. And what I found is that my great-grandmother was not the youngest of 10 children. She was the youngest of 15 children, all with the same mother. They were married when she was about 15, of whom 10 survived to adulthood and 8 immigrated to the United States. And then I'll just point out that this marriage record is from 1884, but they actually married in a religious ceremony in about 1864. So they had been married 20 years when they went to get this marriage license. So, and that's actually important. When I looked in the records, I had to use Schindel's birth name to look for some of the children because they had been listed as illegitimate, and so they were listed under her name. So analyze the findings. Isaac Stern, now we have proved that it was his name. And he used Isidore as a secular name. And then Shindel Briney, that was also confirmed. And she used Sarah and Jenny as her secular names in the US, so the question was answered. Okay, so that's all I have. I'm open for any questions. Oh, okay.
I have 2 questions. One is kind of complicated. I've looked at a lot of census records and a lot of handwritten records of one kind and another, and a lot of the writing is very clear and very, well, it's very lovely. And I'm wondering how the censuses were taken, how records were taken. Did the person involved actually write them, or did somebody come to the door and say, hey, tell me this, and I'm going to write it down?
My understanding, and I'm not an expert on this, but my understanding is that they did come to the door and they wrote it down. And that's one of the reasons, only one of the reasons why you may have mistakes in the census. They may have written something down the way they heard it, and it doesn't represent how people really spelled it. If you look at the page on the census, I think what supports that is that if it's very neat, it's the same neat handwriting across the page. So you didn't have individuals writing their own entries. You had the census taker. Now, one thing about it is, and again, I don't have confidence about the details about this, but in some cases they would write it quickly and then their notes, and then they'd take it home and fill in the forms. And so that's another place errors can be introduced. Some cases, I think there were 3 copies of the census, and one went to the state, and then the 2 of them went to other places. So in some cases, people had time to go write it neatly. They weren't just standing there writing it, so that may help. On the other hand, some of them are really hard to read, you know.
The other question is, where precisely was Galicia?
I don't have it on that map, but it's kind of a sort of vertically rectangular region that encompasses, today it is, I think, entirely in Ukraine and Poland, mostly in Ukraine, although the very northern part of it, I think, is in Poland today.
But not in Romania?
Well, good question, actually. So the very southern part of it, I think there was another region, and the name of it is slipping my mind. It might have been Bukovina. That might have been it. So they're often talked about together, and that region was sort of on the very southern part of Galicia, and it had some independence in the Austrian Empire. I'm not very expert on that, but it does butt up exactly against Romania, and I had ancestors that left Galicia and went to Romania because at the time the conditions were better in Romania. And then sometimes they went back and forth across that border a lot.
Do you have recommendations for sources to find out more specifically about that?
I would go to Jewish Gen.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. So I have a question about names and change at Ellis Island. My name growing up was Keen, K-E-E-H-N, and I was told that it was really Kuhn with an umlaut, and they changed it to 2 E's.
So absolutely, it sounds like they likely changed the name. It's just the statement at Ellis, it's the statement at Ellis Island that's the problem.
Oh, so somewhere else is where it may have happened.
Yeah, names were changed a lot. Just the thing is, people got off the boat and they had a manifest that was filled out at their departure. And the job of the people at Ellis Island was to take these manifests and check the people off as they came in. So they weren't there adjusting names. And think about it, even if they said, oh, I don't like that name, I'm going to give you another one, where does that go? There was no Social Security, no registration. When people naturalized, they often changed their names in the sense that they made the name they were using the official one. For example, they'll say at the time they immigrated, it was a different name. So they changed it then. They could have changed it legally, but in a lot of cases they just used a different name. But there was nothing enforcing any name change that might have been suggested at Ellis Island in the future from there.
And then my paternal grandparents were named Abraham and Sarah.
Oh my,
And so
I'm sorry.
I was like, wait a minute, that doesn't really, so they probably had different names and they chose that here? Or do you think Abraham married Sarah and it was just a coincidence? I was wondering if many Jews just took those 2 biblical names.
I haven't heard of that. I mean, I think you often see a variation, the original name being a variation of Abraham. For example, it might have been Avram, right? So that's not Abraham, but Avram might have been their original name. I haven't heard that. What I have heard is that when the father is unknown on the tombstone, and I didn't talk about tombstones in this, but they'll sometimes say Abraham was the father if the father's unknown. because on the tombstone you often have, it gives the name of the person and their father. But I have never heard that people picked Abraham and Sarah.
It just seems so weird that they.
In Germany, they would give people, add the name Abraham and Sarah in the Nazi era to people's names,
Okay, thank you.
but not in the U.S.
I believe Ellis Island's record started, was it 1891 or so?
Around there. And before then, it was a different
Charleston Gardens?
Castle Garden. Castle Garden.
Castle Gardens.
Yeah.
But something, because my family came before 1891. And I believe there was a fire in Charleston Gardens, so there are no, so where would,
Oh, there are Castle Garden records.
there are?
What I think is that there was a fire at the beginning of the Ellis Island era. I don't remember. There was a fire that covered a couple years. So yeah, that is a thing. But I've seen Castle Garden records, definitely, going back in time. There was a point at which they completely changed the government organization that handled those passenger manifests. But yeah, there are a few years, I think, where records were.
So if your
destroyed.
family came before Ellis Island, except for Charleston Gardens, where, was there anywhere to look?
So you're talking about New York, because there were entries in many other ports. So
No,
I
it's
have
New York. I know they came into New York.
They came in New York. It would be Castle Garden or Ellis Island, and you can look. There is a site specifically for Castle Garden, but you can also look at Family Search and Ancestry are the best sources for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't want to go first or whatever. Okay, I have a historic question about destruction of records. I have Jewish friends who tell me that due to all the historic tragedies over the years, the records are often not found, therefore it's very hard to do Jewish genealogy. Her family was from the Pale in Russia. But I'm kind of curious, people who had valuable things such as artwork, gold, over the centuries, over the millennia, hid these hoards of valuables or snuck them somewhere to be safe, kept safe. And I'm kind of curious about synagogues and Jewish religious centers in many of these places that were very difficult to hold on to your valuables because of the oppression. Is there history of synagogues holding on to some of these precious records and hiding them or sending them to another country?
I'm not an expert on that question, but I think what I would say is that the impression that there are very few of those records is not entirely correct. They're not, as I said, accessibility can be an issue, but if you go to Family Search and page through those metrical records, you can find them because many of them were kept not necessarily by the synagogue, but by the government. Again, the Austrian Empire was very organized, and the Russians were as well. But, things were not necessarily, not all of them were kept. And I think, again, I'm not an expert on this, but, for example, Baptist baptisms sometimes were just kept by the minister, and when he didn't keep them, they just went away. And I think in some cases, in some small communities, that might have been what happened to the Jewish records as well. They just were lost. Yeah.
Last question.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. One is about records. Do we know where the originals are, and how do we know how complete the databases are that have the records you're speaking of? And then on some, what do you call, family trees, I've seen deported, and a date. Is there some way of finding out more exactly what happened to those folks? And also, you said the name changes were not done in Ellis Island. They were done somewhere else. So especially if you know of a name change, how do you know where those happened, and what do you know about where those happened, mostly to anglicize the names?
Yeah, so I'm just gonna be very quick because we're over time, but, you know, the name changes, in some cases, they happen in court like they would today, but in some cases, people just started using the name and there was nothing that really, you know, before Social Security, right, there was nothing really that checked up on it. And even today, you can use a different name as long as you're not trying to cheat someone. So, you know, you can't always track it down. You have to look at the records. And then, when you're talking about deported, I assume you're talking about during the Holocaust. Is that right? So there's a lot of resources, and if you can get the handout that I prepared, there's a lot of resources on there. There's lots of databases where you can go look at them. And then as far as how complete or where these other records are, I recommend, again, Jewish Gen, but that Routes to Roots website, which is in the handout, that will tell you where the records are, what years they cover. It doesn't give you the records, but it tells you what years are covered and where the records are, where their, you know, archive is. And then you may need to do some research and networking to figure out how to get a hold of them. So.